All right, and welcome to the thematic section of the Trek Table today. We've been digging into Trek Table episode number 42. We've been talking about this episode, Rubicon. And now we're going to take a chance to kind of braid everything together. We've been talking about it in all of these different segments, whether it's Marie Has Questions, our disco recap, fashion freestyle, disco design, and of course, all the Trek Table questions we've been talking about. So as I see this episode, one of the things that struck me from the jump was just we're on this season arc trajectory about the complicated relationships of all of our friends in the universe at this time. And as we're seeing Book and Tarka have to continue to try and meet their goal, it's very clear that Burnham and Discovery and the rest of Starfleet is trying to stop them. And so it just brings up all of these complicated relationships. It felt like in the sharing, Admiral Vance was acknowledging the complication, and it almost felt like maybe a connection to people was a weakness. So I just want to invite a couple of us to respond to this conversation about these complicated relationships. What are you seeing in this episode? At one point, Vance even said Saru is even compromised because he didn't say compromised, but Saru is also connected to Book, so Mr. Saru could not be that counter check that Vance ended up sending Non to do. So I just want to ask, let's talk a little bit about these complicated relationships this week. Maya Mama, you've been sharing a lot today. I want to invite you to jump in on this topic. What do you think?
Yeah, I gotta say, knowing someone makes you vulnerable. That's really that's what the Federation is about. That's what the Federation does, is that they open themselves, and it does create some vulnerability, but that's how you create trust. You can't have trust without that openness, and that's just how the Federation is supposed to work. Now we see Torkelson, who is completely unwilling to open himself up to anyone, which means he can't actually really fully work with someone. And I just want to say, like, just imagine if he actually was able to connect with a person, and just how much better and bigger and what he could produce. Saru has complicated feelings, I think, about race when it comes to a relationship with President Tarina. That's what I was really feeling about it. And I was really vibing some, like, I'm not really sure, like, I really, really like you, but you are a Vulcan. Because he's from the past. Back in his day, they just didn't do things like that. That's all I got.
Nice. I love it. Claudia, your thoughts on complicated relationships in this episode?
Well, it feels like every other show I watch, it gives me this plot point, gives me this story beat. Emotional vulnerability will make you so you can't make good decisions. And then it gives you a storyline that proves that true. This is why I love Discovery. Discovery gives me storylines that are super fresh. Like this was a very tense episode. And it was tense because you had two people who were like fighting each other. They knew each other really well. Like they each knew each other's moves so well that they could guess what the next move was going to be. They could interpret it really well. And neither of them actually wanted to hurt the other person. And it turns out that when you have two people having a battle, having a conflict, where neither of them actually wants there to be harm, it's so much more interesting than when you have these black and white villains that are just so I go, oh, give me more stories where people are deeply connected and are negotiating that. I'm here for it.
I appreciate that riff because as I'm hearing that, I'm thinking about the ways in which these connections and like literally Book as a empath, as a Quajanian, is able to connect at a physical level. I mean, I know when we're looking at the fashion, he finally did start to wear his Quajan necklace, that ceremony, rite of passage that he supported his nephew going through. So just this idea of connection, and I think it just felt serendipitous as a transition to say, Malika, as we were getting ready to welcome you onto today's episode, I just thought it was super amazing and perfect that you study the ways in which organic matter can actually connect and share a charge or share a connection. And so I'm just wondering about, for you as a scientist, for you as a Trek fan, like how are you seeing this these complicated relationship, and is this idea of organic semiconductors a helpful metaphor in this moment as we think about it?
Well, absolutely. It's actually kind of fascinating because, I mean, we always think about the material side, like I focused on, but then now you have this advanced species and we have these empaths, these people who can connect to other species. And now in this era, this version of Star Trek, you have people who can actually connect physically, mentally to inanimate objects. The ship is a living thing through, and now and we have people who can actually connect to it, mentally empower it and stuff. And it's next level. I mean, for someone who works in the space, that would be the dream if we could actually figure out how to do that. And it probably would take a combination of the right tech, but the right people. I don't think everyone would have to be able to do it. That's like also some tenets of sci-fi, right? That some people have the right brain synergy or right brain energy to make that work. But yeah, it's some next level stuff. I thought, oh, well, wouldn't that be good if we could actually do some of those things? So
Thank you. I love it. Marie, your thoughts on complicated relationships, organic semiconductors?
Oh, yes, I have tons to say about organic no, uh, yeah, I mean, complicated relationships are exactly that. Like they're complex and it's not, binary. It's not, it just has so many layers and that is, yeah. And I agree with Claudia about how it's really awesome to see explored in this show because they are giving each other so many chances. They don't want to hurt each other, but they both have their missions that are very much in conflict. It was great to have that tension of having Non there to make this final decision, and for Burnham to come up with this kind of like last minute solution so there's a compromise on both ends. That's what the show is about, and it's great to see that modeled.
Yeah, and I'll just say I felt like that got modeled in that final moment where Burnham is in the shuttlecraft and she has flown all the way to book ship. And I'm just curious for our generational Trek fam, is that the first time we've ever seen that kind of shuttlecraft to viewer? I've never seen in Star Trek two ships meet like that shot we got between. That feels like a Star Wars. I'm used to in a Star Wars context seeing ships near each other, looking at each other. It's part of the joke at a certain point in some of the Star Wars worlds. But it felt like for me this was the first time I saw this connect, like literally like what you all were just saying. We're watching as this episode's building and we get to this moment where the producers, the writers show us everything is peeling away. It's just like the episode where Burnham and finally had the private communication bubble. So I'm just honoring that we're getting these new kinds of ways to have intimacy and connection in front of other people as people try to work it out.
I don't think that they generally recognize windows except as looking out at the stars, or like, what's that? Like when there's an anomaly in space. But they generally, I don't think that they really do the window thing, which I think is yeah, it was really interesting. I really loved it. It was such a beautiful shot.
Yeah, and I'm using that as this transition to this final topic in Thematix, which is, we're talking about these complicated relationships, but what I also got out of this episode, I'm curious about folks' thought, is like, but we also got the healing part of connection, or the benefit part of it. Wasn't just we're working out what are the conflicts because we're connected, but here's Saru connecting and reaching out to Tarina. Here are ways that characters were reaching out in this episode. So I'm going to come to you, Claudia, and ask, was there elements of this connection part of the episode that weren't just the bad part of I'm worried about you not fulfilling this expectation, but here are all the benefits of connection?
Well, this was definitely an episode that had a lot of themes of connection in it. And Discovery, I feel like it's always been a show that's been about honestly reflecting on trauma, generational trauma, the trauma of war, and then allowing us to actually experience the healing rhythms. That's partially because Star Trek Discovery is not episodic, so it allows us to actually live through the entire story, and have all of those impacts, and that gives us the ability to really get invested in Commander Non's journey. And I was so curious about what happened with her attempt to return back to her family. it would be like to try and return to a planet that had moved on by hundreds and hundreds of years. I really love that they have Culber as somebody who can give good advice, but it's also beautiful that people have other folks that they can reach out to. Like Saru didn't reach out to the formal person that's there to help him. Saru reached out to a friend, and I think that's beautiful as well.
I love it. And one of the things that I was struck by at this episode was Non saying that Barzans are duty first. And so there was almost a very stark decision. There's no decision but duty first. So for Non to also come out of this episode and talk about a middle ground, I thought was really, really powerful. Malika, I'm going to toss to you. Thoughts about the way these connections you're seeing in this episode?
One thing that jumped out at me when we were talking about the window, actually thinking about it, are we just not going to acknowledge that Homegirl pulled a classic Black woman drive-by on her ex-man? Like, like you didn't return you ain't return my calls, you ain't answering my calls, you're not returning my texts. I'm gonna roll up. And I was just sitting there, like the inner Black one of me was like, yes, girl, roll up and see what's going on. So I definitely appreciated that. I am really also curious to learn more about this other thing that's going on with Saru, because he's a complicated kind of guy, and his, like you guys mentioned, his culture, he's coming from a different era, and he's been just stoic throughout all of this, and now here is him taking care of his needs, and and somebody's meeting him halfway saying, I can help you with the rest of your needs, let's have this meal, and he's like getting all scared. So I'm really curious to see if he can actually find a way to lean into that part of himself. I mean, to me, that was like the Starfleet equivalent of sliding into somebody's DMs, right? I mean, like,
Yes.
basically. So I'm really curious to see what happens next. I enjoyed it.
I love that. That is clippable. Saru calling Tarina is slipping into her DMs. Get that? Yes, yes. I love it. My mama, your thoughts on connection?
Well, I think that a lot of this was like a fear of failure, both with Saru and with Non. Is that if Saru doesn't do this right, then it could be an international or an intergalactic incident, and then there'll be war because he didn't have a good date. I mean, it felt like these were the spiraling things that were going through his mind. And with Non being, it can either be one or the other. I just really felt like there was some her having to sit with discomfort, sit with failure, with uncertainty. She seemed to refuse that those were things that actually existed. And I think that validation was like an additional thing that was put upon for both of them. Tarina giving validation to Saru for having feelings, and Michael coming and taking Non aside and acknowledging and validating her very real fear about what would happen to the crew, what would happen to the remainder of space.
Awesome. And I'm sure there are so many more thoughts. Friends in the chat, I'm excited that we're going to be chatting with you about this. We're curious your thoughts about connection and complicated relationships and organic semiconductors in this episode. That was our thematics for Star Trek Discovery season 4, episode 9, Rubicon.